let's start with this. You have several different universes going on. So you've done this, you've gone through this several times. How do you personally, like your own method, get started with magic and technology in those universes?
So it's kind of hard to say, because when you go at world building, you're gonna start off. Every author is gonna start in a slightly different place. There's gonna be the authors that will start with characters and no world. They'll say, "Oh, I want I'm gonna start with a police sergeant, and then I'm gonna try to build a world around that character that I've already developed in my head that I love." And there's other authors that will say, "Oh, I'm starting with a magic system." And I've come up with this cool magic system. For instance, like mine is Powder Mage, which is mages who snort gunpowder to gain magic powers. And then build a world around that. And basically, however you do it, the way you'll start with what you love or what you've already developed, and then you kind of build upon that. And you're gonna, at least the way I do it, is I extrapolate. I say, okay, this is what the character I want, or this is the magic system. What is the world that exists around it? And a huge part of that's going to be technology. And most epic fantasy has always been very kind of a quasi-medieval thing going on, where it's all you can't really pin it down to a century, because it's so, it's got that weird, there's knights, but then there's also there's technologies that didn't exist when knights actually were there.
Right. It's a hodgepodge of like the early modern world with Renaissance stuff and medieval stuff and some random classical stuff thrown in occasionally. And it's like the greatest hits of history, essentially. Rule of cool.
And we can get away with that because we're writing secondary world fantasy.
Right.
And which is a huge amount of fun. There's always going to be limits to that, though. Even though, like, one of the hard limits that I had always heard before I did Powder Mage was, kind of the gunpowder technology. Even though we know that gunpowder existed centuries and centuries before what we think of as the age of gunpowder,
right?
And could easily slide into most epic fantasies technologically, but they just most authors just kind of ignore it. Right. Someone will sprinkle a little in there, or make references to it, things like that. But you just kind of ignore it, and which works, because when you're creating a world, you want to focus on, like you said, the rule of cool, and you want to focus on what people, on the story, on what's happening in the middle here, and you see a lot of, especially like bigger epic fantasies I'm gonna go ahead and call out Jordan because he's so big that
do it. This is a safe space. We can critique people and still love them, right?
Right, of course. And I mean, Wheel of Time was like, that was the middle of my teens, was Wheel of Time, just in love totally. But you look at his stuff, and it gets so big that he starts grabbing bits of technology and history and just kind of winging them in there just for fun, and then building the whole sections of books around. I'm trying to think, was it Matt who was working on gunpowder during the middle of the books? I don't remember, like, it's been a decade since I read the books, but so you, a lot of these bigger ones, you'll kind of see authors just kind of, get into a slog where they're just grabbing everything they like. And I've been totally guilty of that. But when you're looking at world building, especially with something smaller, I say smaller, like my first trilogy is still 500,000 words. But when you're looking at something smaller, it's going to be, you need to focus. You need to be tight about what you want to care about, and what you want to bring to the attention of the readers. And so, for me, the whole aspect of technology with the magic or versus the magic, that was like a central theme of the book. Because I mean, Powder Mage has 4 different magic systems, which I do not advise. A terrible idea.
We will talk more about that later.
But the three main magic systems that I had in there, I very specifically set up from the beginning to be a old school nobility magic system, to be a kind of a commoner magic system, and then a magic system that kind of represented the advancing technology and the rising middle classes and things like that. And because my world was set in its own industrial revolution, very 1800s vibe, early 1800s, late 1700s vibe to it, that worked. And that bringing attention to that was very much on purpose and very much part of the world building rather than a distraction from the world building.
Absolutely. So you introduced it in a way where it was very focused on the themes that you were discovering in the book as well and exploring in the book as well. Things like old school versus new school, things like technology versus the old ways.
Yes. So that's kind of, I feel like I've been rambling on the original question here, but I do that a lot. So, but that's kind of how I think about it. In terms of world building, is what do I want to focus on? What are the readers going to question? So if I'm designing a magic system or a world with particular constraints, I don't need to just kind of do whatever I want. Right. I also need to think a lot about, when a reader is reading it, what are their questions going to be? If I bring up it's the smoking gun. Was the Chekhov's gun?
Chekhov's gun, yeah.
Chekhov's gun. If there's the Chekhov's gun, if I bring something up that is a really obvious question that half of my readers are going to say, "Oh, I wonder where he's going with that," and then I don't go anywhere with it, then I failed as a writer.
You betrayed a promise. Yeah,
right, exactly. And so that's a big part of the world building and creating constraints around how my world interacts with itself, which goes back to technology and magic. Technology, especially for somebody like me who is writing an industrial revolution, that's going to be way more important to an author that's working on that time period, or a replica of that time period, rather. Than an author who kind of does that quasi-medieval where, it's 800 years of whatever just kind of thrown together. It's way more specific and way more important to the story, because I'm drawing attention to an industrial revolution is all about this advancing technology and how the world is changing, and how it just affects everyone.
Sure.
And you take something something as simple as the steam engine, which I don't get into in my books, but you take that and you look at how it changes the world in 50 years, like a very short period of time. Then you're gonna need to focus on that if that's the part of your world that's important. Trains, things like that. I very purposefully came in a little bit before that in terms of what I was aiming for a technological level. Because I didn't want to deal with that. I didn't want to deal with the trains and steam engines and all the implications. And I also didn't want, because when you get into steam at all, there's already a very established subgenre of steampunk. Right. And that I don't know that genre at all. I know it has all of its own things. But I didn't want to touch that. I didn't want to get into that and feel like I needed to delve into the steampunkish sort of the trappings, basically.
Right, exactly.
What people will expect from me writing in that subgenre. I wanted to create something a little different and a little new, and with kind of this flintlock fantasy is the term that I'm not sure if he coined it, but it's the term that I heard from Brent Weeks first, when he blurred my book, which was pretty cool. Which Flintlock Fantasy isn't new. Like there have been Flintlock Fantasy books over the last 30 years, as Lee Modisett reminds me every time I'm on a panel with him. I wrote that 25 years ago. I love Lee.
Hipsters doing it before it was cool, right?
Right. But that's kind of like individual little snippets, little examples. Whereas like kind of I kind of was lucky enough to get in right at the beginning of a genuine subgenre kind of explosion, which you see a lot of now. Django Wexler's first book came out 2 months after my first book, and and he's a fantastic author. Does he kind of it was funny because I was very worried when I heard that he was writing flintlock fantasy based on Napoleonic kind of themes and feels. I'm like, oh crap, we're coming out at the same time, and this is going to be really awkward and weird. And then it came out, and I read the first book, and it was just as different from my books as any quasi-medieval fantasy is from another quasi-medieval fantasy. And and then I've seen a lot more of that kind of stuff coming out over the last few years, and it's been really cool to see, and very fun. And my next series is still going to be flintlock fantasy. It's cool. It'll be a total departure from Powder Mage, but it's still gonna have that feel of early 1800s.
Very cool.
And it's but now, especially with that being more of a thing and people trying to blend genres more and do new things, I think we're going to see a lot more of that idea of technology and magic either coming into conflict or rising together or changing the world, things like that. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in epic fantasy over the next decade.
Yeah, definitely. So just to recap some of the points that you've made there, you really thought a lot about the kind of story that you wanted to tell and the kind of themes you wanted to explore when you were building your technology and magic, which is super cool. The other thing that I love that you brought up, so I'd like to extrapolate for our audience to some points from that, because there's so much gold in what you just said. That you deliberately excluded things that were outside the scope of what you wanted to deal with, which is absolutely as important as what goes in the box, what goes outside the box. What do you not want to deal with? What is outside the purview, at least for now, at least for this book or this D&D campaign or this whatever, that you do not want to explore, because that is really freeing as an author or a DM, just to be like, this thing over here, this bugbear, not looking at that, but I am looking at this. And it really means that you can double down on what you are doing, and you can bring that out in so many more different ways and not get sidetracked on that other thing that you knew already that you didn't want to deal with. So that's amazing. And that's a really good guide for anyone who is starting a world, or for anyone who is, working with technology and magic and trying to bring that into a world, into a novel, into a campaign.